Interrogating climate change education epistemology, identifying hindrances to curriculum development. Educational policymakers today are facing the unprecedented challenge of having the responsibility to teach students about the imminent and unavoidable climate change catastrophe, while at the same time bearing the responsibility for students' well-being and flourishing. To the best of knowledge, never in educational history such a challenge was put at the feet of curriculum developers. The philosopher Bruno Latour, when addressing the immense challenges involved in transitioning humanity into living in climate change, an Earth he described as a land so different from nature, he posited, adapting, adjusting, coping, all sorts of words that mean how to live in the ruins. In his further contemplations about this old but new hostile land that we are now entering, Latour ponders, look at what is necessary for landing one robot on a Mars mission. Imagine what it will require to land 8 billion people on Earth. Inspired by Latour's provocation, this presentation aims to examine what it would take for education policymakers to develop climate change curricula that may support students to live and thrive in an era of climate change, an era of uncertainties, frequent disasters, and social, economic, environmental instabilities, where tipping points are crossed, leading to the unknown. The process of developing a climate change curriculum invites us to embark on a journey of epistemological, ontological, and axiological clarifications concerning the nature of climate change knowledge and its application in education. The coming together of curriculum and climate change body of knowledge into one framework requires complex integration of diverse evidence-based theories and practices, all working together to create an effective climate change curriculum reflecting qualities of scholarship, debate, and research. In supporting these efforts, this presentation puts forward the aim to interrogate current epistemological approaches for conceptualizing climate change, critically evaluate Education for Sustainable Development, ESD, as a framework for implementing climate change education, point out ineffective approaches and false assumptions, and make practical suggestions that may be helpful in supporting the development of defensible and well-argued climate change curriculum. The presentation addresses the following topics. Discuss the epistemological question, what is climate change as a body of knowledge? Consider climate change education conceptualization within the framework of Education for Sustainable Development. This part consists of a chronological examination of the formation of the ESD agenda, examination of the appropriateness of the ESD agenda to host climate change education, tensions between ESD and the content-based curriculum, and tensions between ESD and the scientific consensus concerning climate change, ESD learning domains discourse as a hindrance, and finally, I present conclusions and recommendations for climate change curriculum development. I would like to note here that ESD is the term used by UNESCO when referring to the educational approach, otherwise known as sustainability education, education for sustainability, environmental sustainability education, and other associated terms. For the purpose of consistency, in this presentation, I use the formal UNESCO term ESD. However, I regard the associated terms is equivalent in meaning to ESD. Climate change, what is it? Is it a discipline? Is it a field of knowledge within a discipline? Perhaps it is a concept, an idea, a theme, a capacity, an event, a crisis, a process, or an aspiration. This fundamental epistemological question seems critically under-researched. Review of the literature reveals a range of seamless and uncritical descriptors of climate change body of knowledge. The majority of publications addressing climate change education seem to agree on one thing, that climate change is multidisciplinary or otherwise referred to as interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, while the epistemological descriptor multidisciplinary conveys the idea that the knowledge is derived from multiple sources. It is not helpful in addressing the epistemological question of what this knowledge is. Furthermore, this epistemological descriptor forms hindrance for effective climate change curriculum development in two ways. First, by giving the false impression that we have characterized the body of knowledge, where in effect we have not. Secondly, by providing a conceptual springboard for the misinformed conclusion, assuming that if climate change is multidisciplinary, then it follows that climate change needs to be taught in multiple subjects. Concerning the first hindrance, characterizing climate change as multidisciplinary is epistemologically lacking. This is because most knowledge created by humans may be characterized as multidisciplinary. Take, for example, a concept such as photosynthesis. At its narrowest, it involves physics, light energy, chemistry, light energy transformed into chemical energy, and biology. The transformation takes place in proteins. At its broader interpretation, photosynthesis is a critical aspect of ecology with its contribution to biomass and bioproductivity. Photosynthesis is also involved in biogeochemical cycles impacting the climate. Greenery forms an essential part of urban landscaping, architecture, biodesign, and more. The same can be said for most disciplines. They are all multidisciplinary in essence. Biology evolved from zoology and botany. Ecology evolved from biology, chemistry, physics, and earth sciences, and so on it goes. Furthermore, characterizing climate change as multidisciplinary is insufficient because it still leaves us with the question of what are the disciplines that make up the multidisciplinary knowledge. Obviously, if there are no disciplines, there is no multidisciplinarity. In Gardner's words, if no single discipline is being applied, then clearly interdisciplinary thinking cannot be at work. The second hindrance is of particular concern. Here it is assumed that if climate change is multidisciplinary, then it follows that climate change ought to be taught in multiple subjects. This misleading conclusion seems to typify the approaches to climate change education inclusion in the curriculum. Unlike any of the other curricular multidisciplinary subjects such as history, civics, geography, and science, only the multidisciplinary body of knowledge that makes up climate change seems to have the unfortunate fate of being fragmented and dispersed across the curriculum in what is known as the cross-curriculum approach. The dispersal of climate change contents across the curriculum poses a range of hindrances for effective teaching and learning. It poses challenges to integrative assessment, content development, forming learning progression, resources development, and provision of teacher professional development, to name a few. Furthermore, the dispersal of climate change contents across the curriculum violates a very basic principle of knowledge acquisition. For knowledge to be processed effectively, It needs to be systematically structured and organized. The cross-curriculum dispersal approach makes this principle unachievable, leaving students and teachers on their own to collect the fragments and integrate them. Cross-curricular themes are placed low in the curriculum hierarchy. They are characterized by lack of subject boundaries, lack of achievement benchmarks, and standardized tests for assessing learning outcomes. This can be exemplified in the Australian curriculum, in which the sustainability cross-curriculum priority is marginalized with little evidence of implementation. From an implementation perspective, the evidence suggests that while the cross-curriculum approach is highly advocated, very few countries implement this approach in their curricula, and when they do so, it scarcely filters down into actual implementation. When addressing the discrepancy between cross-curriculum advocacy and its poor implementation success, the literature commonly tends to lay the blame on the curricula, schools, and teachers for not trying hard enough. However, this lack of success is grounded in educational theories and may be inferred from theories of learning, teacher knowledge, and curriculum theory. In summary, multidisciplinarity typifies most fields of knowledge, and thus it is an insufficient epistemic characteristic of climate change. The cross-curriculum approach for implementing climate change education is empirically ineffective and theoretically unsubstantiated. But can climate change be characterized as a discipline? In previous work, I have made a case for conceptualizing climate change as a discipline. As a discipline, climate change can be broadly described as dealing with interactions between multiple human and non-human systems that directly and indirectly involve changes in climatic patterns. These include, for example, the study of socioeconomic systems and technological revolutions and the multiple pathways and feedback loops by which these systems impact and are impacted by changes in climatic patterns. This broad definition of the discipline aligns with the original climate change definition proposed in 1992 by the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change. Article 1 of the UNFCCC defines climate change as climate change means a change in climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. Over the past 100 years, climate change research has evolved to demonstrate a wide range of characteristics typical to disciplines in relation to the ways in which the knowledge is produced, applied, valued, and evaluated, as well as rules and concepts related to governing epistemological principles. Disciplinary knowledge is never fixed and always fallible and open to changes. This is clearly the case with climate change, where the discipline's boundaries and contents have expanded over the past 100 years. Since the early studies by Guy Callender, who in 1938 showed that the steady rise in temperature over a century is associated with the rise in carbon dioxide. Viewed from climate change curriculum development perspective, there may be benefits in conceptualizing climate change as a discipline. This epistemic approach may be particularly helpful in overcoming the hindrances associated with the multidisciplinary conceptualization and the cross-curriculum implementation approach. This is because, unlike the unspecified and disorganized knowledge delivered through the cross-curriculum approach, knowledge organized and bounded by disciplines is more suitable for teaching and learning through curricular frameworks. Thus far, no form of knowledge organization has been found to be more effective than disciplines in offering structured and organized knowledge. Beyond these two opposing frameworks, the literature offers a range of climate change conceptualizations. One example is conceptualizing climate change as forming part of science literacy. According to the essential principles of climate science literacy developed by U.S. Global Change Research Program, climate change is purely a field of science. Furthermore, the report makes no distinction between climatology, the discipline that studies the climate, and climate change. These two terms are used interchangeably. Additionally, there is no distinction between naturally caused changes in the climate in past geological eras and the current human-caused climate change. Other publications offer other conceptualizations of climate change. For example, climate change is a theme of education for sustainable development, or climate change is a geographical process, or an environmental issues, an energy system issue, or climate change can best be addressed in civic education. A review of the literature identified 21 different terms associated with climate change education. I am not familiar with any other curricular subjects or even topic where there are no agreed terms to signify the body of knowledge under consideration. The literature reveals what seems to be an empty debate as to which term is capable of including more of the world's problems, where each term pushes aside the former term, claiming that it is not inclusive enough, or emphasize problems that were not sufficiently emphasized under the other terms. The multiplicity of terms suggests that climate change education as an educational field is grounded under neologistic exercise of naming and renaming rather than having any meaningful epistemological debate related to the nature of knowledge at hand. Overall, the lack of terminological consistency is an indication of the lack of conceptual clarity. This, in turn, may be acting as a hindrance for developing in-depth epistemic discourse and thematical organization of climate change body of knowledge. The epistemological ambiguity of climate change, to some extent, may be explained by its close association with UNESCO's conceptualization of ESD. We can trace this conceptual development along a chronological path. The roots of ESD are in environmental education. Since the early 1970s, environmental education began to evolve and spread worldwide. Environmental education was a content-based field dealing with the educational implementation of environmental science. The scope of environmental education was laid out in 1977 in the first Intergovernmental Conference on Environmental Education in Tbilisi, Georgia. It can be seen that the goals of the environmental education were essentially the same as ESD. Both fields call for the integration of environmental, social, and economic considerations. Both call for the acquisition of knowledge, attitudes, and behavior and aim to change behavioral patterns. However, I suggest that there is an important difference between the two fields. This is an epistemic difference. Environmental education evolved as a content-based field, whereas ESD is a problem-based agenda. I will expand on this later. For now, it is sufficient to state that during the 1970s and up to the 1990s, increasingly countries introduced environmental science or environmental studies as subjects in their own right in the secondary curriculum. The learning outcomes were evaluated through standardized tests and matriculation exams. The growth of environmental education research and implementation ceased in 2002 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa. In this conference, ESD has officially displaced environmental education as the leading educational framework. In the 2002 World Summit, the United Nations General Assembly designated the years 2005 to 2014 to be the United Nations Decades of Education for Sustainable Development, DESD, and UNESCO was nominated as the lead agency. Since then, UNESCO has been leading the ESD agenda. The DESD strategy identified 15 strategic perspectives that form the scope of issues addressed by ESD. Examination of the 15 perspectives reveals that most of them do not represent any organized body of knowledge. Epistemologically, they may best be described as a set of world's challenges or problems relevant to the time of their conceptualization in the early 2000s. Consequently, UNESCO's conceptualization of the DSD was described by Kwak as turning a robust field of environmental education into a 21st century simulacrum of education for sustainable development, detached from reality, or more precisely, untethered for the planet. Later in 2012, at the Rio Plus 20 conference, UNESCO introduces an addition to the DSD perspectives, an educational program about consumption and production. 2 years later, in 2014, the DSD is coming to its closure, and UNESCO introduces a new framework, the Global Action Program on ESD 2015 to 2019. In this round, the 15 perspectives were abandoned altogether. Instead, from here on, UNESCO's publications focus on positioning ESD as an agenda that aims to utilize education for the purpose of societal transformation as an end goal. Priority Action 4 describes the means as empowering and mobilizing youth. In the 2020 roadmap, this goal takes a stronger tone with statements such as education needs to transform itself. The roadmap also sets the aim to review the purposes and values that underpin education and reorient all levels of education and learning to contribute to sustainable development. The document further calls for surveillancing education systems and to ensure that education institutions are monitored and assessed for progress on how well they develop learners' capacities as change agents. Epistemologically, across these documents, ESD appears as an agenda and not as an organized body of knowledge. Schools and education systems are called upon to reroute their purposes and educational operation modes to serve this agenda. These statements make me wonder whether it is morally right to allow any agenda to govern and repurpose the curriculum. Many educators may feel alarmed by this apparent attempt to hijack the education systems for achieving a prescribed agenda. This is because many educators share the view of schools as places where children are supported to grow to their full potential, whatever that may be, and not as training facilities for prescribed purposes. Gerd Biesta expressed this view in stating that what they, the students, will do when it matters, that is, when they encounter something in their lives that addresses them and calls for them, is something we can never know in advance, which always means that it is fundamentally beyond our control. Furthermore, Biesta suggests that instead of asking what the schools should do for society, which seems to have become the most prominent way in which the task of the school is nowadays being conceived, I ask, meaning Piesta asks, what society should do for the schools so that the school can be a school. Going back to the end of the decade for Education for Sustainable Development, in 2015, ESD conceptualization shifted once again with the adoption of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 for global transformation. This time, ESD was viewed to be included in Target 4.7 of SDG 4, Quality Education, Target 12.8 of SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, and Target 13.3 of SDG 13, Climate Action, thus allocating ESD a minimal role in the SDGs. I'm assuming that this was not what UNESCO had in mind, and in 2017, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 72 on 222 broadened ESD's role once again to be an integral element of the SDG on quality education and a key enabler for all other sustainable development goals, thus forming a new list of ESD issues. The table presents a comparison of ESD issues when transitioning from the DESD strategic framework to the SDG framework. It can be seen in the table that except for gender equality, all the other titles have changed. Even climate change is now changed to climate action. When we take a closer look at the three SDGs in which ESD appears, we can see further ambiguities and incoherences, which may in turn pose hindrances to climate change curriculum development within the framework of ESD. First, we can see that three different targets related to three different goals are evaluated using the same indicator. From a curricular perspective, assessment that does not clearly indicate what has actually been assessed is not fit for purpose. Another ambiguity concerning the indicator is that it differentiates between two separate pathways for achieving the goals. These pathways include ESD along citizenship education. This conceptualization diverges from UNESCO's earlier conceptualizations of ESD, where ESD was all-inclusive. It is also worth noting that the conceptual disconnect between Target 13.3 and its indicator. Finally, it was surprising to find out that while ESD was announced as an enabler for all the SDGs, no ESD data whatsoever was collected by the United Nations for their monitoring of progress towards sustainable development goals. In summary, the chronological analysis reveals that epistemologically, ESD may best be characterized as an agenda for addressing the world's main challenges. This entails a perpetual conceptual inconsistency. This is because problems and challenges are always transient. Similar to the problems and challenges that individuals encounter throughout life, the world's problems are also continuously changing over time. It follows that attempts to organize curricula around problems rather than around structured knowledge will meet insurmountable challenges in relation to all aspects of curriculum design. I would like now to discuss the suitability of ESD to host climate change education. González Bodiano described ESD perspectives as an elusive thematic group of issues made up of various fields of knowledge, each having its own identity and autonomy as a field. ESD provides an empty space of congregation for the various fields and in turn becomes an empty signifier. There are no rules and regulations that govern the ways in which the empty space is filled, making ESD knowledge ephemeral, anecdotal, with no rules and concepts of organization. Contrarily, climate change has evolved over the past 100 years as an organized body of knowledge with rules for determining claims of truth and well-defined concepts and principles that govern the knowledge production. Climate change curriculum aims to educate students about these concepts and principles. One way to demonstrate these differences is by comparing climate change concepts with sustainable development concepts. We can think, for example, about the concept of greenhouse gas. This concept is governed by the scientific rule of molecular vibration and re-emission of infrared energy. We can make a claim of truth as to whether a substance is a greenhouse gas or not on the basis of whether or not it follows this rule. This is not the case in ESD. The absence of such governing rules and principles is not a minor issue in ESD. Rules determine truthfulness. That is, claims of truth are judged by the extent to which they adhere to the consensual rules and principles of the field of knowledge. In the absence of rules, claims for truth cannot be refuted or verified, thus leading to a relativist worldview where all claims are equally valid. Such is the case, for example, with BP, a company responsible for the emissions of 340 million tons CO2 equivalent per year in 2020. This company can safely claim on their website that our purpose is reimagining energy for people and our planet. We want to help the world reach net zero and improve people's lives. Under the ESD framework, such claims are not refutable and may be accepted as truth. While CC knowledge is expanding and being continuously revised in the typical disciplinary characteristics, the basic concepts that constitute this body of knowledge present relative stability over time. No such stability can be attributed to the various ESD challenges, not even at the basic level of terminological stability. Consequently, Kwok questions ESD epistemology altogether, stating that it is not clear whether ESD is meant to be an orienting principle, an actual subject, or an umbrella term encompassing environmental education, climate change education, and other permutations of ecologically oriented principles. Finally, ESD received axiological criticism. It was suggested that the ESD agenda creates dangerous opportunities for corporates and interested actors in the neoliberal market to justify continuous economic growth by reinterpreting and molding the sustainable development approach to support their interests and undermine efforts to seriously address climate change. ESD was also criticized for its instrumental and anthropocentric approach to nature, conceiving nature as a resource. Selby went on to suggest that ESD has become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. In continuing on path to evaluate whether ESD is a suitable framework to host climate change education, I will now discuss two tensions that arose from the literature. The first is tension between the ESD agenda and the content-based curriculum, and the second is tension between ESD and the scientific consensus. Most curricula worldwide present some degree of content-basis organization. This form of organization requires that the teaching be organized around content knowledge. However, ESD is not a knowledge-based agenda, but rather a problem-based agenda. As such, there is an inherent tension making ESD difficult to fit into existing curricula. This inherent tension between content-based curriculum and ESD application was noted in a number of recent studies. However, often these studies explain the low uptake of ESD by blaming the curriculum structure and presenting it as the problem. Here I suggest the opposite. The ESD agenda forms a barrier for effective climate change education, not the curriculum framework. Different countries take different approaches to resolving these tensions. Some countries resolve the tension by including ESD as an almost separate entity aside from their subject-based curriculum, where ESD with its climate change contents are not examined, have no benchmarks, and do not represent any typical curriculum characteristics. Such is the case with the Australian cross-curriculum priority. In many countries, ESD, 30 years after its first appearance in the world stage, is still mostly implemented by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, focusing mainly on awareness raising rather than on any specific content learning. The peak international body representing the well-organized and conceptualized climate change education is undoubtedly the IPCC. However, some evidence suggests that ESD may be getting in the way by muddling the science facts, drifting climate change education away from its evidence-based sources. This may be exemplified by comparing the ways in which the term mitigation is defined by IPCC as compared to its definition within the ESD framework. In IPCC, the term mitigation is defined as follows: a human intervention to reduce emissions or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. Within the ESD framework, Mochizuki and Bryan, in presenting UNESCO's Climate Change Education for Sustainable Development program, defined mitigation as follows: climate change mitigation is defined by the United Nations as a human intervention to reduce the sources of greenhouse gas emissions primarily linked to human actions of production and consumption. Mitigation efforts includes a range of interventions to stabilize and reduce greenhouse gas concentrations, such as investing in renewable, non-polluting energies and designing greener technologies, conserving energy, promoting changes in change consumption patterns and lifestyles, and reorienting economies, social structures, value systems, and ideologies that have resulted in the emissions of excessive greenhouse gases. We can see from the comparison that the ESD version adds a range of unsubstantiated factors and generic slogans to the original IPCC definition. Without delving into the lack of evidence basis, it is sufficient to state here that some of the added claims are not aligned with IPCC and they are controversial at the least. In summary, it appears that ESD is not a suitable host for climate change education. The broad evidence presented thus far suggests that climate change curriculum is more likely to fulfill its purposes effectively when organized around knowledge, not when organized around periodic challenges, as is the case of ESD and SDGs agendas. In the same spirit, Selby and Kagawa unapologetically suggested that recent calls for the integration of climate change education within mainstream education for sustainable development should be resisted. I will now move to discuss one more hindrance associated with ESD. This relates to the distinctions between cognitive learning, socio-emotional learning, and behavioral learning. Throughout UNESCO's publications, there seems to be a persistent distinction between three domains of learning. The cognitive domain comprises knowledge and thinking skills necessary to better understand the SDG and the challenges in achieving it. The socio-emotional domain includes social skills that enable learners to collaborate, negotiate, and communicate to promote the SDGs as well as self-reflection skills, values, attitudes, and motivations that enable learners to develop themselves. The behavioral domain describes action competencies. UNESCO went a step farther by specifying the specific capacities in each domain as they apply to each SDG. For example, in SDG 1, No Poverty, the socio-emotional objectives state that the learner is able to collaborate with others to empower individuals and communities to affect change in the distribution of power and resources in the community and beyond. And the learner is able to reflect critically on their own role in maintaining global structures of inequality. I note here UNESCO's unrealistic expectation that school students would demonstrate the capacity to mobilize change in the distribution of power and resources in society as an expression of socio-emotional capacity. They also claim that students need to reflect on their own negative role in maintaining social inequality. Not only that these learning outcomes are detached from reality and detached from theory, but they also seem to cultivate behavioral repentance as an educational approach. The ESD literature presents various unsubstantiated claims suggesting causative relationships between socio-emotional learning and behavioral change that brings about sustainability. To the best of knowledge, there is no empirical evidence that may support such claims. Research in cognitive psychology since the early 1950s suggests the contrary. Emotions are not causally related to behavior. Additionally, a robust body of evidence suggests that individual behavior change cannot cause sustainability. The evidence for this claim is presented elsewhere in my publications. UNESCO continues to make the unsubstantiated claim that ESD can produce specific cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral learning outcomes that enable individuals to deal with the particular challenges of each SDG, thus facilitating its achievement. This discourse raises concerns regarding the validity and the meanings of these terms. UNESCO's publications do not explain how the three types of learning differ pedagogically, how they differ in relation to their respective learning outcomes, and how they can be measured. From a cognitive psychology perspective, the discourse concerning the three learning domains is at odds with theories. Current research suggests that there are no distinguishable brain processes that differentiate between cognitive and emotional epistemic. Emotions form part of cognition. Emotional aspects are built into definitions of cognition. They are not separable. For example, Green and Yu propose to define cognition as a process involving dispositions, beliefs, and skills regarding how individuals determine what they actually know versus what they believe, doubt, or distrust. Expressions such as doubt or distrust inevitably involve emotional aptitudes. The intertwining of cognition and emotions is further demonstrated in Moise et al.'s definition describing emotions as interrelated psychological processes that include affective, feeling nervous, cognitive, ruminating thoughts, motivational, a desire to escape, expressive, displaying a frown, and physiological, increased heart rate components. Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her theory of constructed emotions, takes this notion farther and eliminates altogether the distinction between cognition and emotions. For her, emotions are simply concepts. These concepts are dependent on a combination of physical properties, the flexibility of the brain to respond to its environment, and the culture and environment in which emotional responses evolve and operate. The elimination of borders and distinctions between cognition, emotions, and behavioral learning goes one step farther in recent research showing that cognition and emotions are physiologically embedded. The three domains are essentially intertwined. Fogila and Wilson emphasize the role of embodied cognition, suggesting that mounting empirical evidence shows that bodily states of modality-specific systems for perception and action underlie information processing, and that embodiment contributes to various aspects and effects of mental phenomena. Taken together, it appears that the distinction made between cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral learning represents a positivist reductionist understanding of learning that does not have credence in evidence-based research. These terms seem to be hanging loosely, where the topological distinction is unable to provide evidence as to how these so-called categories of learning can be taught separately, learned separately, and assessed separately as constructs that represent meaningful understanding of the educational process. Thus, the three different terms are misleadingly used to describe the same process, learning. The interrogation of climate change epistemology and hindrances associated with conceptualizing climate change in the framework of ESD have led to the following conclusions. Climate change as a body of knowledge is under-investigated. There is no shared conceptualization and even no shared terminology. The cross-curriculum approach for including climate change in the curriculum is the most advocated approach. However, empirical evidence suggests that this approach is not working as well as expected. Furthermore, no evidence-based theoretical frameworks have been presented thus far to suggest why this approach can and should work. ESD agenda is not a suitable framework for climate change curriculum development. This is because curricula function well when organized around concepts and knowledge, not around agendas made of transient challenges. A concerning finding was that ESD delegitimizes school education as social institutions for supporting children to grow to their full unknown potential. The ESD agenda put forward the aim to utilize education for the purpose of societal transformation in what seems to be an attempt to hijack the education systems for achieving its prescribed agenda as an end goal. Finally, it seems at odds with ESD seems at odds with curricular structures and purposes, and at times it may be overlaid with unsubstantiated agenda-informed claims. And there are a few recommendations. The first suggestion is to dissociate climate change education from ESD and develop an independent climate change curriculum. Secondly, it is recommended to consider implementing climate change as a subject or a topic within a subject as a standalone on its own right, rather than applying the cross-curriculum approach. Thirdly, it is advisable to use one agreed-upon term consistently. The IPCC uses climate change as the agreed term. It seems appropriate to identify the field by this name. Finally, further research is required for identifying the key themes, concepts, and skills constituting climate change literacy across the range of economic, social, political, governance, and scientific and technological aspects. Thank you for listening. You may find here the recommended citation and the reference list that follows.